On behalf of the Center for International Studies, I welcome you. I'm John Tierman. I'm Executive Director at the Center, and we're very pleased to have all of you here tonight in this difficult winter season to hear one of the leading scholars on Iran, Abbas Milani. We have also tonight the special pleasure of having our friend Ali Banuazizi with us to have a conversation with Professor Milani afterwards. First, I want to, however, alert you to a couple of other events coming up that we are sponsoring or co-sponsoring. First, on Iran, actually, this Friday will be a panel discussion on a new volume that's just been released, The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future. It promises to be particularly interesting. A lot of, I think Danny Postal is, Mike, where are you? Who is speaking? Danny Postal and?
Nader Hashemi.
Nader Hashemi, okay.
Are the two editors.
And some others, yeah, are the editors, right. So that should be a good one, and that will be at 7 o'clock at Building 6, Room 120, 6120. For those of you who don't know the numbering system at MIT, I can't help you with that, with where that is. Who knows where 6120 is? Off the main quad. Okay, you can find it on the map. The other event I'd like to announce is, that I will announce, in fact, is on February 25th, also a Friday, at 2 o'clock in E40, our conference room of the Center for International Studies, which is at 1 Amherst Street. I know where that is, since that's where I work. On Afghanistan, the second decade. Afghanistan 2014, the second decade. And the featured speaker will be Yasin Athanasiadis, who is a journalist who has spent a good deal of time there and will be moderated and discussed by Kristen Faub, who is a graduate student, and Fotini Christia, who is a assistant professor of political science. So a couple of interesting events coming up, and watch our calendar for others this spring. I will introduce Ali Banuazizi first, who is a professor of political science and psychology at Boston College and a past president of the Middle East Studies Association. He's a longtime colleague of ours and a friend of the Center for International Studies. He's graciously agreed to carry on the discussion with Professor Milani after a few remarks from our guest, who has just written and published this interesting volume on the Shah, and he will discuss that tonight. He is the Hamid and Christina Moghadam Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University, and a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science. He has been, or is, a research fellow and co-director of the Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institution. He has taught and been researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. He was a assistant professor of law and political science at Tehran University and a member of the board of directors at Tehran University's Center for International Studies from 1979 to 1987. And among his many publications, and there is a long list of publications here, which I won't go through, he is the author of Eminent Persians, Men and Women Who Made Modern Iran, 1941-1979, in 2 volumes from Syracuse University Press. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Abbas Milani.
There's a chair here, I think. Ali will sit here. It is indeed, my computer is trying to tell me I have to do a talk at MIT. Really, this is exactly what it's trying to do. It is, for me, a pleasure and I must say a daunting pleasure to be talking here. This is, after all, the place the movie 21 was made. And this is the place where they beat Las Vegas, something that I never did. It is also in the presence of many of the most eminent scholars on Iran and many of the most eminent men and women with whom I had the pleasure of working with in Iran or had the pleasure of hearing of them. Professor Zarghami, for example, who was here and had a very critical role in making Iran's most famous technical university, Sharif, what Sharif has become. Khashi Jawahirian, one of Iran's most eminent biologists, is here. He's a very old, 40-year-old friend of mine. So it is with absolute humility that I begin to talk about this book a little bit, and then we will have, as indicated, a conversation. And the subject of my talk is essentially why do we need a biography of the Shah now, and what is its relevance to today? I think events in the last few weeks since the publication of the book have helped the cause of this book. I never anticipated that Egypt would help sell Shah books, but it has, unfortunately. Many people have seen parallels between Iran and Egypt, but I think the fall of the Shah, in my view, is one of the pivotal events of the 20th century. In the review in Wall Street Journal of this book, the reviewer begins by saying that the only event comparable in terms of its historic significance and consequence is the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. That's how serious they think the events of the fall of the Shah were. And I think if you look at the Middle East, many of the events that have continued to be significant events have some very important link to the fall of the Shah and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. And sadly, I think much of what has been written about the Shah in particular has been either demonological or hagiographic. They have attempted to lionize him or demonize him. And very little effort has been given to try to really understand what the man did, what he stood for, what were his thoughts. He did have thoughts. He was a serious person about modernizing Iran. And I think, in my experience, almost everywhere where you touch below the surface, the shibboleths about him prove to be nothing but shibboleths. Almost everything we know about him, if we decide to take a kind of a Cartesian point of view, doubt everything but doubt, and not accept anything, then almost nothing about what we think we know of him stands really the test of scrutiny. From his childhood to whether he was a happy student in exile, whether he was a reluctant monarch in the early decade, whether he was a constitutional monarch in the early decade, what his role was in the events leading to the fall of Mossadegh, what his views were on, for example, land reform, his relationship with the United States, his relationship with the Soviet Union, for example. On each one of these, when you look at the evidence, an image begins to emerge that is far more complicated than what we have now assumed. And the image is neither necessarily in his favor, nor is it neither necessarily to his disfavor. It's simply more complicated. In some ways, writing a kind of impartial account of the Shah is really only possible now. Even if we wanted to write an impartial account of the Shah 3 years ago, it would have been impossible because so many of the critical documents we need to understand documents, for example, from the American archives, from the British archives, some documents from the Russian archives, documents from the German Stasi archives. These are now all available. They were not available before. The documents on Iran's nuclear program, for example, they became available literally as the book was already in print. And I had to hold it. I had to download about 1,000 pages of new documents at the National Security Archive in truly a remarkable collection of documents that fundamentally changes what we know about what U.S. Shah's relations were on the nuclear issue. They're very different. The U.S. relationship with the Shah on the nuclear issue, based on these new archival evidence, is very different than what most people have assumed to be. In other words, the United States, the assumption is gave the Shah a green pass, and the United States only decided to stop it when the Islamic regime came to power. That doesn't stand this test of scrutiny. The evidence, in fact, seems to indicate that there was considerable tension between the Shah and the United States over Iran's nuclear program. Many of the issues that have now made this into an impasse were very much the problems raised with the Shah, and problems that Shah, to his credit, was not willing to give up easily. In these behind-the-scenes documents, the Shah repeatedly says, I will not be treated like a second-class citizen. I will not allow Iran's right to be squandered. We want all the rights within the NPT. So, in a sense, while I think it is increasingly important to understand him and understand his fall, it has now become possible to really have at least access to one side of these archival material. What is greatly missing from this, certainly from my book, is Iranian archival material. The Islamic regime has virtually produced nothing of value about the Shah. And I say this with some certainty. What they have published is essentially worthless about the Shah himself. What we do know is that the Shah's office was one of the most organized in the country, Daftar Makhsus. It was run in the last 15 years by one of the most impeccable managers Iran had in that generation. His name is Moinian, impeccably honest man. His office was one of the first to be computerized, the Shah's office, Daftar Makhsus. Everything that went in was registered. Everything that was reported to him was registered. And not a single page of that Daftar Makhsus documents have reached us yet. We know two things. One is that the Shah ordered a copy of them made and sent them outside, and ordered the other copy burned. And the general who burned it, by the name of Nishat, got sent to the firing squad, probably because of this. So there is very credible evidence, including a call to Stanford demanding $5 million for that collection. And I told them, unfortunately, I haven't received my paycheck yet. I don't have that kind of change. But they claim that there is this collection outside Iran. Once this collection becomes available, I think we will have a very, very different view. We can fill in many of the gaps that still exist. On many of these issues, we have the American version, the British version, the Russian version of what was said. In many of these cases, we don't have the Iranian version, the Shah's version. And if you've ever worked with archival material, there's always very important differences. I was fortunate in one sense that part of this lacuna was filled for me by having access to the remarkable collection that Ardeshir Zahedi has of his papers. Ardeshir Zahedi was Iran's ambassador in the last 12 years, 11 years, or 10 years. Before that, he was a foreign minister. And in spite of his appearance, in spite of what the image of him is, he was a kind of obsessive archivist. He kept every paper that ever went through his hand. And he has a very remarkable collection. I'm happy to say for Stanford that the collection is coming to Stanford. He has donated it to Stanford. Parts of it have arrived, small parts of it. The bulk of it is yet to arrive. These are very, very important in understanding at least the U.S. role with the Shah. I have used them extensively in the book. And I think one gets, again, a very different image of the Shah's relationship with the U.S. and the U.S.'s relationship with the Shah. Some of the politicians that were prominent in that period, some of the private letters they sent to the Shah are truly very, very remarkable. I've used those that I have been allowed to use. Some of the documents, very important documents, I was not allowed to use. I was asked to withhold them for a happier time. But the ones that I were allowed to use do fill in at least part of this great gap. I think, in a sense, the one sentence that I think captures him the best was articulated by a British scholar, Anne Lambton, who said in 1955, "The Shah is a dictator who cannot dictate, and he won't get out of the way to let others manage the country." I think he meant well for the country. I think he really wanted Iran to modernize, but I think he went about it in a very wrong way, thinking that only he knows what is good for the country. Many of the people that were very capable of helping him and helping him save the country from what it eventually befell it, I think were deprived of that right. And precisely that deprivation, I think, is one of the roots of the revolution and the reason for the consequence of the revolution. The reason for why the clergy won in the revolution has also to do with his policies and directly has to do with his views on the role of religion. The Shah fundamentally altered Reza Shah's paradigm of modernization. Reza Shah's paradigm called for the curtailment, serious curtailment of the number, the influence, the arenas of presence for the clergy. I have some statistics on that in the book. From literally the day he ascended the throne, the Shah changed that paradigm and began to encourage the clergy to participate in the political process. He brought back Ayatollah Qumi, gave Ayatollah Qumi everything Qumi asked for, and all you have to do is read Muntaziri to know that the clergy knew immediately that the game had changed, that the Shah was now on a new mode. He virtually destroyed every opposition group. He virtually deracinated the loyal middle in Iran. He clearly went after the left. He did not allow any kind of a moderate opposition to exist. And when the system went into crisis, the only institution that had a national reach, the only institution that could hold the country together was the clergy. And Ayatollah Khomeini, in a famous letter or an infamous letter to Carter, basically says, what you want is a government that is anti-communist, that is willing to sell oil, that is capable of holding the country together. We, the clergy, are capable of doing that. Disarm the military, and you will get what you want. And that is exactly what happened. The U.S. government had a crucial role in making the peace between the Iranian military and the clergy. It is remarkable to me that the regime that has come to power with the direct influence and help of the American embassy in Tehran today accuses the Green Movement of complicity with the U.S. And every time they mention this, I remember the number of documents that are there that indicate how closely they worked, how, in fact, Ayatollah Khomeini volunteered to have contacts with the U.S. in France, how he agreed to essentially answer a questionnaire about the kind of a government he wants to create in Iran, which was incidentally not a Velayat Faqih, but a democratic government. And for this government to then accuse the opposition, the Iranian democratic opposition, of being complicit with the West is truly one of those remarkable facts of life. Thank you, and I will try to engage the conversation with you and with Professor Banuazizi.
Thank you so much. And I want to begin by thanking my good friend John Tierman for his kind invitation to me to be added to the main feature for the evening, to celebrate this singular achievement of Professor Milani, the book that hopefully you have already acquired. I know probably most of you haven't read it yet, and will in due course read it. I think it's a book based on years of research. It's a singular achievement in that sense, but also decades of personal experience that Dr. Milani had as a member of the opposition to the Shah back in the 1960s and 1970s, then as a young professor at the National University in Iran, and subsequently as someone who chose exile in the United States. It's also an extraordinarily readable, captivating, and literate book. It's really a pleasure to read, and one that is compassionate and humane in its attention to the details of the lives of the people that he describes. I want to make my comments as briefly as possible so that we would have the benefit of the conversation with Dr. Milani, and perhaps some of you may want to draw him out a little bit to talk about some of the similarities and differences that he sees in the 1979 and the 2009 crises in Iran and what is going on in the Middle East today. I think those are fascinating issues, and I know that Dr. Milani has spoken on those issues, has written on those issues in the past couple of weeks, and I think, like you, would be eager to hear his views on these matters. So let me make my comments very, very briefly and limit myself perhaps to a couple of observations. The first one is that I think this is like a warning to the reader that it's possible to misread this book in a particular way. And that is that this is fundamentally a biography of the Shah, an extremely rich biography that clearly puts the life of the Shah in the historical and social and cultural context, but it is yet a biography. And perhaps in some of the statements, in some of the concluding statements in the book, Dr. Milani emphasizes the character issue of the Shah, the weakness, the vacillating character of the Shah, in such a way as to, first of all, interest the reader. It makes it into, as he, I think, acknowledges it, into a Shakespearean drama. But clearly, this is not a book about the social or political history of Iran for the past 30 or 40 years. There's a lot about that history in it, but it's written from a particular perspective, a biographical perspective, so that the reader may come away with the conclusion that character is destiny. And in fact, at some point, Dr. Milani himself makes such a statement. Now, that may be true, but it should not becloud our vision of what happened in Iran during these years. The project that Dr. Milani referred to of modernization, industrialization, major developments in the Iranian society, economy, brilliant performance of the Iranian economy. At the time, I remember back in the 1960s and 70s, Iran was referred to as the second Asian miracle after Japan. The promotion of higher education in Iran from almost 0 universities or one or handful of universities to well over 100 universities, and developments in practically every other realm of scientific, social, economic, and cultural life of the country. Now, the people who made those changes, who brought about that transformation, in fact, Dr. Milani has devoted his previous book to, that Dr. Terman referred to as the Eminent Persians. The subtitle is very important: The Men and Women Who Made Iran from 1941 to 1979. So Dr. Milani, of course, is well aware of that. And much of what they did was, I would say, not independent of the Shah, but perhaps in spite of the Shah sometimes, but at other times with the Shah's full support. And that history should never be forgotten. In other words, the developments in Iran during those decades, he was on the throne for 37 years, cannot be read exclusively from the perspective of a biography of the Shah. And I think this is probably not what Dr. Milani ever intended either. He wanted to do justice to the topic, which is the understanding of the Shah and his times. The second point that I want to make has to do with the character of the opposition to the Shah. This is a theme which figures very prominently in the book. I believe Dr. Milani characterizes that opposition into essentially 4 groups: the secular democratic opposition, mostly nationalist, and quite frankly, by the 1960s and 1970s, not a very strong, not a particularly active or sophisticated or capable group. These were, for the most part, elderly people who had been around Mossadegh back in the 1950s. The second group that he describes as the opposition is the relatively progressive religious opposition to the Shah, which began to rise in the 1960s and 1970s. One can think of, for example, the main ideologue of the Iranian Revolution, Shariati, as one such person. The third opposition group that Dr. Milani describes is the leftist Marxist opposition to the Shah. And the final group, of course, is the conservative, radical or militant opposition personified by Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, if one were to look at the character of the opposition and the demands of the opposition and the world views of the opposition, I think one would not be particularly encouraged in making that assessment. This was not a sophisticated opposition. This was not a democratic opposition. This was not an opposition, and now I'm thinking particularly of the leftist opposition, that knew the country very well. This was an opposition in part inspired by the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War in the Tudeh Party, and then in part by various radical Marxist groups, some of which resorted to violence. Now, I speak of this episode with some degree of pain because I myself identified with that opposition for much of my own early, quote-unquote, political career as a student and as an activist here. But what we knew about Iran and the kinds of demands and the kinds of visions that we had about Iran were very warped, ideologically warped. I think in that respect, another comparison that I would like to draw is between Iran, and you might be surprised by this, but Afghanistan, because it was in Afghanistan that the leftist opposition came to power in 1978, the initial revolution that occurred in Afghanistan and brought to power the Marxist-Leninist government of Afghanistan. Those individuals were like us in the leftist movement in Iran. That was their vision of the society, which was a total distortion of the social and political realities of the Afghan society. This is all prior to the Soviet invasion, by the way, of Afghanistan. By some accounts, in fact, we had a conference here at MIT, the Russian cultural attaché said, you know, we went into Afghanistan in order to limit this government, in order to moderate this government. In other words, the Marxist-Leninist opposition in Afghanistan, which was quite similar to the Marxist-Leninist opposition in Iran, was quite naive about its reading of the political realities. So those were the elements of the opposition that the Shah had to contend with. Now, rightfully, Dr. Milani points out that the Shah was so preoccupied with the communist opposition to his rule that, in a sense, he allowed the religious opposition to take root and to blossom and to become what it ultimately became. I believe he's correct about that. But bear in mind that the left doesn't have a particularly positive history in Iran. The record of the religious opposition is very clear by their own accomplishments after they came to power. So in making an assessment of the Shah's role, his failings, his accomplishments, one should take into account, I believe, these two other factors, which, as I said, Dr. Milani is fully aware of. That is the role that various other segments of the Iranian society made. You know, students, the intelligentsia, the scientists, the bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. You know, at one time we had something like 70,000 students in the United States alone studying in various universities, most of whom went back to Iran and took part in the building of this modern Iranian state and society. So I'd like to stop there, and as I said, this is the night for us to benefit from Dr. Milani's presence here, and I would be more than happy to participate in that conversation, but really it should be his wisdom, his reflections that we should all welcome and celebrate for this wonderful and singular scholarly achievement, the book. Thank you.
But when we get to the questions, please come to the mics because this is being recorded for MIT World.
Don't be bashful.
Would you like to break the ice? Would you like to break the ice a little bit?
There is no ice. The ice is outside.
Well, this area we're so
nothing
used.
but warmth. I feel nothing but warmth here. No, I think just briefly commenting on what you were saying, I think the irony of the revolution, the Iranian revolution, is that these groups of opposition, which were essentially united in one thing. I mean, I think the defining characteristic of, one of the defining characteristics of our era in Iran is the fight for modernity, is the battle for modernity. It begins during the Constitutional Revolution, and it goes on today. And the groups of opposition that he mentioned, the Marxist opposition, the religious opposition, the secular opposition, and the Pahlavi regime itself, these have four different paradigms of modernization and modernity. The remarkable fact of the 1979 revolution, the enigma of the 1979 revolution, is that these modernizers, these three modernizers, united behind the most articulate and relentless anti-modernizer in modern Iranian history to oppose the Shah. That's the enigma. And part of the responsibility for that, of course, is with the Shah, who did not allow Iranian society to understand what Ayatollah Khomeini's writings were about. Instead of making those mandatory readings, instead of making everyone read Kashf al-Asrar, everyone read Vilayat al-Faqih to know where this man stood. The man had spoken his mind, but the problem was that the book was banned. It was part of the underground literature. And Ayatollah Khomeini very cleverly positioned himself from the day he entered Paris. In the 118 days, he gave over 120 interviews. Not once did he mention his past ideas. Not once did he talk about what he had written for 40 years. And the Iranian intelligentsia, fooled by, some of them fooled by shallow thinkers like Al-Ahmad, who literally influenced the whole generation. Some of them essentially so angry at the Shah. And this is, I think, again, part of the consequence of August 53. The Iranian opposition, we have a Persian word for it, I don't know what the English word is. They were qahr with the Shah. You know, they were completely unwilling to compromise on anything. They were unwilling to accept that this man can do any good. We were part of Confederation. One of our slogans was that the Shah cannot and does not want to make any reforms. We went out of our way. I was part of a research group amongst the students outside. We were trying to prove that this, the white revolution, particularly the land reform, was really not a land reform. It didn't fit in our vision that the character like the Shah could actually do land reform. And this poisoned atmosphere that was created, and then I think, as you mentioned, some of the mistakes that the opposition made, compounded by the despotism. I mean, if you look at 1962, as far as I know, nobody in opposition comes to the defense of the Shah when the Shah proposes a law that was, for its time, the most progressive law in any Islamic society. That law became essential practice in the United States just a few years ago when the first Muslim African American was elected to the House, and he wanted to take his oath to Quran and not to the Old Testament, to the Bible. And that created some kind of a stir, if you remember. In 1962, Iran wanted to pass a law allowing religious minorities to take their oath of office to their own book. That is a remarkably progressive idea. Find one person who wrote an article saying, while the Shah might be evil, while Mossadegh might be the incarnate nationalist hero, this law is good, we should support it.
You know, just very briefly, surely one can blame the Shah for not allowing these expressions, but I'm sure you would agree that the Iranian intellectuals also carry major responsibility for this failure. As you well know, now late in 1978, Ayatollah Khomeini had essentially written out or spoken in a series of lectures his vision for an Islamic government back in 1970. So as late as 1978, I don't know of any Iranian intellectual who had actually read the book and had in any way or form commented on the book.
I had read it, but hadn't commented on it.
Right. So
Professor Algar gave it to me.
Right.
Khashi knows. Algar gave it to me, and Algar gave it to somebody who visited from Iran, and I was shocked.
Right. But at that time, you didn't speak out, and
Of course.
And I think I know the Iranian intellectual community. Nobody. Can you imagine somebody who is clearly on the horizon, who by that time was the undisputed leader of the Iranian Revolution, and who had written his views? I read the book in October. In fact, somebody sent it to me, and I was shocked, and I didn't say anything. Perhaps like you, I thought that, well, these are things that he has said. What relationship do they bear to what he will do when he will come to Iran? I mean, those are, the reflections of a jurist. They don't necessarily show the way to the manner of his rule. All right,
I think the Iranian opposition was almost in its entirety children of the Enlightenment. And in the age of Enlightenment, the illusion was that religion is the opiate of the masses, that these ideas are medieval ideas, that they are on the decline, that we live in the age of reason. Nobody thought that these things could be put into actual practice. If you had told me in 1978 that you can actually stone a woman in Iran, I would have said, you're crazy. This is a country that 80 years ago hung Nuri, Ayatollah Nuri, for saying these kinds of things. Yeah. That's how we didn't know the country, that there was this subaltern structure and a very nimble network to put those ideas into practice. And not only we didn't know it, Savak didn't know it. I mean, the incredible thing is that you look at there were two attempts on the Shah's life, both of them by religious forces, both of them blamed on the leftists. The leftists had virtually nothing to do with these assassinations. Nikah had virtually nothing to do with this assassination on the Shah in 1965. But they blamed it on him, the first time that the Shah was assassinated, because they wanted to have an excuse to go after the left.
In 1949.
In 1949. I asked the head of security for the guard of the Shah's guard. Remember, in 1965, the guy who's guarding inside the court with a loaded machine gun was someone who had a record as a radical Islamist who had attacked Ali Amini, who had associations with radical Islamists. I said, how come you guys didn't pick this up? He said, we weren't looking for this. In fact, if somebody had religious affiliations, we wanted them in, because we thought the communists would not get to him. Talk about putting the fox in the henhouse.
I'll start with a question. I'm sure there are a lot of people who will follow. My question has to do with this phenomenon of destroying the middle and the left and so on, and the repercussions that obviously had. And my question has to do with U.S. thinking about that at the time, because this actually is a pattern of U.S. foreign policy, is to support that kind of destruction, particularly of the left, of course, but it often means the middle as well in practice, in countries where it then came back to rebound against U.S. interests. So what's your reading of what the U.S. was telling the Shah while he was beating up the opposition?
I think the documentary evidence doesn't support the claim that the U.S. was telling the Shah to destroy the middle. In fact, the opposite is the case. From 1959, it was virtually the official policy of the United States to try to get the National Front into the government. From 1959, if you read some of the analysis of the CIA in 58, 59, they literally predict the revolution right around the corner. And they said the only people who can save this country is a coalition government with the National Front. The American embassy sends someone into prison to negotiate with the leadership of the National Front in 1962 and offers them a cabinet. They said, first form a coalition government, and then within a very short while, we will allow you to form the cabinet itself, and the Shah, we will push to be a constitutional monarch. But they were qahr with the Shah. They didn't want to have any piece of the Shah. They said Mossadegh has to come out of prison. Mossadegh was in prison. In some ways, they were right. Mossadegh was the leader. The Shah didn't want a piece of it. The same was offered to them in 78. In 78, the initial policy of the United States was to try to get the National Front to form a cabinet government. They went against Sadiqi. They completely tried to destroy Sadiqi when Sadiqi had the guts and the wisdom to understand that the country is in jeopardy and he must step forward. Someone who had been in opposition to the Shah for 30 years. Someone who had refused to take a passport because he said, this government is a government of a coup d'etat, I won't take a passport from it. He didn't go see his daughter. When he saw the country in danger, he said, I will step forward. I will form a cabinet. He had one condition. The Shah had to stay in Iran. But the Shah had lost his nerve. He wanted to leave. But the National Front did everything it could to destroy first Sadiqi, and then Bakhtiyar. When the Shah negotiates with Sanjabi, documents that memorandum of this conversation is there. Sanjabi says, I can't form a government unless Ayatollah Khomeini gives me the green light. And then he has the mendacity to add, if you really want me to come to power, hold the government, put the military in power for 4 months, maybe Khomeini would lose some of his popularity, then maybe I will form the government. This kind of leadership was very responsible for what happened to Iran. These are the Iranian intellectuals that he's talking about.
Right.
These are the people who decided to prefer their own reputation to the fate of the country, who did not have the wisdom, the sagacity, and the bravery of a Sadiqi. Bakhtiyar, I think, was brave, but I think under a delusion. Without the military, he had no chance to stay in power. His demand that the Shah should leave the country foredoomed his fate from the beginning.
Dr. Milani, I have a question regarding earlier comment. From what I recall, it was Bakhtiyar, the Prime Minister Bakhtiyar, who stated or coined the phrase "Istibdad al-Na'alayn," or the tyranny of the mullahs. How could the rest of the National Front not see what Bakhtiyar saw? And also, we cannot forget the treachery of Ayatollah Khomeini by saying in the Islamic Republic, even the left will have a role, everybody will have a role. That's, I think, it's important. I would like to hear your comment.
Well, I think you might have arrived a little late in my comment. I did make that I did say that Ayatollah Khomeini completely hid his true intentions, and not once, one of my students wrote a paper on Ayatollah Khomeini's 120 interviews in Paris. There isn't once a mention of Velayat al-Faqih. The first draft of the constitution that Ayatollah Khomeini signed in Iran doesn't have Velayat al-Faqih in it. Iran is to be a republic. So he completely breached his contract with the people of Iran. That's why Iran hasn't seen peace for 30 years. And I don't think Iran will see political peace unless that breach contract is re-signed and people get what they were promised for. People were promised democracy, not clerical despotism. What the National Front's leaders saw, I am truly at loss for words. How they did not see this, and not just the National Front, some of the freedom movement. There are some very incredible stories that I have described some of them. For example, Bazargan is sent to Paris after a meeting with Shariat Madari, Bazargan, and some commanders of the military to go and tell Ayatollah Khomeini that if you delay coming, the Shah will be going out, there will be a Regency Council. By the time he arrived in Paris, he changed his mind. He didn't take that message. He accepted to become the Prime Minister.
Professor Fisher.
I'd like to probe a little bit for some of the things that you found that you were astonished by, that you say are that we knew nothing about. So two of the things that I'd like to ask about is, one, the role of Ayatollah Kashani in reinstalling the Shah. I grew up in Iran, insofar as I lived in Iran, in a very different world than the two of you describe. I knew very few leftists. I knew a tradition that celebrated Ayatollah Nuri as a hero, Kashani. I was educated in part in Qom under the auspices of Ayatollah Shariat Madari, who did his best to tell people what Khomeini was up to, who tried to form an opposition party The question there is, it's true that the National Front was, as Ali says, largely older people. It used to be said that the revolution was conducted by a few men in their 70s and a lot of young people in their 20s and 30s, and there was no middle generation. That middle generation were the intellectuals that you bemoan, as well as most of the National Front. If they were not already in their 70s and 80s, they were part of the cowed, missing generation as well. But I wonder what you found, what happened in those crucial months when things were fluid. Of course Khomeini wasn't going to tell people the more non-democratic side of his intentions. I mean, he was a politician. Politicians are not fully open, none of them, including our own much beloved president. So I'm curious about why there was not more coalescence around many people who knew what was going on, who had a fear of Khomeini, who had a fear of Ayatollah Beheshti, and who somehow couldn't coalesce.
First of all, on Ayatollah Kashani, I think the evidence is very clear. He did have, not just Kashani, Ayatollah Kashani and Boroujerdi had a clear, in my view, determining role in the overthrow of Mossadegh. I think it is extremely exaggerated to say that it was the CIA that overthrew Mossadegh. The CIA was trying to overthrow Mossadegh. They did have a plan, but what really turned the table on Mossadegh was the change of heart by Kashani and Boroujerdi. Many of the people, the thugs that were brought out, were the thugs that Kashani had begun organizing from 1942. He is on record. Nawab Safavi is on record in 42 saying we got to get these thugs and organize them. They are our fighting battalion. I have written in a book that 25 years before Fanon and Marcuse discovered the revolutionary characters of the lumpen proletariat, the Islamic brother, Fadayan Islam, were organizing the lumpen proletariat. Ayatollah Shariat Madari, I've described it extensively in the book, I think was one of the bravest, most astute Ayatollahs. He clearly understood the danger, but he was also a political figure. He couldn't come out openly in defiance of Mossadegh, Khomeini, but he did everything. He did exactly the warnings that you suggest. Ayatollah Shariat Madari volunteered to contact the American embassy. The American embassy couldn't believe that an Ayatollah has actually opened this dialogue. They said, "Are you sure this guy is a representative?" They said, "Yes, send a representative. I want to talk to them." And he said, "You don't know, I know this man. And this is danger. Do everything you can to keep the Shah in the country, change the situation, do everything you can. Don't allow this." But it was, I think, all too little, too late. And in my view, the key that made it impossible for the opposition to coalesce was that the Shah was a weak, vacillating personality who broke under crisis. He broke under pressure in 1953. He broke under pressure in 1979. He was counting days to leave the country. He just could not. Some of the reports about his psychological mood, the people who have gone to meet him, from the French, from the British, from the Americans, is just remarkable.
Mr. Ketabi.
You mentioned that new information has surfaced regarding Iran's decision to build pressurized water reactor in 1974, starting 1974. It was advertised at the time, I was a student then, that Iran will run out of energy in 30 years and that we need access to nuclear power, and that is the best way to get there. Now, these new documents that have surfaced, do they verify those kinds of mental? Because Iran's reserve in oil has actually increased from then. So that argument basically was not valid. But there were other things. Balance of payment, because price of oil was going up. and somehow the balance of payment had to be adjusted. The nuclear power plants are expensive pieces, and in one shot you can make quite a bit of adjustment, as well as military equipment and other things that we know of. But what was the question is, what was the true intention of the Shah in ordering up to, I believe, 10 nuclear power plants?
20.
Although 20.
20.
Well,
The plan called for 20.
Yeah, so.
Again, what the documents show is, first of all, you're right. The Americans were very much encouraging the Shah in the beginning. In fact, I have seen references to a paper, I have not yet found the paper, that Stanford wrote, the Stanford Economic Institute, that said Iran needs 20 reactors. There are references to this study, but I have never found the study. I think the decision that to go nuclear was made by the Shah, and it was clearly part of his new attempt to establish hegemony over the region. Scott Sagan talks about 3 models, 3 reasons why countries go nuclear. I'm sorry, you wanted to say something.
When you're talking about what was advertised was for power plants under IAEA, but you're talking about hegemony. You're using very different incentives.
No, if you allow me, I will explain. The Shah decides that he's going to become the hegemonic power in the region. And he decides this, again, contrary to the common myth. He decides this before Nixon comes to power. The Shah decides from 65 that Iran is going to be the hegemon in the Persian Gulf after the British leave. The British are very much opposed to this idea. The Americans are initially lukewarm. When Nixon comes, he is completely in sync with it. Part of this new hegemonic authority was to have a nuclear program. And the nuclear program, according to everything you see there, very soon begins to worry the Americans. As soon as they see what the plan is, the Shah was going after plutonium processing, it was going after enrichment, heavily investing, billions investing in all of these. At one time, the CIA estimates that if Iran's plutonium processes are conducted, are finished as Shah envisions, Iran will have enough plutonium for 600 bombs. The minute the US begins to feel that the Shah is going after at least dual technology, if not the bomb, they put the stop on it. From 73 to 77, the US companies are barred from selling to Iran. There are behind-the-scenes negotiations going on between the White House, State Department, Defense Department. They want assurances, and the Shah is very reluctant to give assurances. Eventually, he gives up the plutonium processing. But he says, we want the full fuel cycle. It is within our rights in NPT, and we are not going to take anything other than the NPT. And the Americans keep saying, you're investing monies that doesn't make sense for a peaceful nuclear program. Akbar Etemad, the head of Iran's nuclear program, he says, I began to worry whether the Shah wants the bomb. And he says, I went to His Majesty and said, Your Majesty, if you want to make the bomb, you got to tell me.
These are different plants. You need to get different kinds of reactors. The question is, was this fact ever played a role in his demise vis-a-vis America withdrawing support? The fact that he wanted to have a full fuel cycle?
I have never seen any evidence that the United States planned to overthrow the Shah of Iran. I have never seen the oil issue as well, although there were intense confrontations. My search indicates, and I might be wrong, I don't have access to CIA, I don't have access to intelligence agencies. If the documents from the American archives, the embassy is correct, till November 78, it was the stated policy of the United States to do everything they can to keep the Shah.
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Milani. Changing channels right now. Looking at the recent events in Tunisia and Egypt, do you think the time is right for regime change in Iran? Second question is, if not, what can the U.S. do to bring about regime change in Iran?
What kind of U.S. policy?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, by supporting dissident groups or.
Regime change in Iran is not the business of the U.S. government. It is the business of the Iranian people and nobody else. The U.S. government should stay out of business of regime change. Every time they've tried it, they have monumentally failed. Just look at Iraq, and you will see the cost of regime change when you try to bring it. The good news is that there is a very viable democratic movement in Iran. The U.S. policy can help this movement or it can hurt it. Oftentimes it has hurt it. When Bush gave his axis of evil speech, that clearly hurt the Iranian opposition, that clearly hurt the Iranian reformists, made it impossible for them to make the case for a reasonable foreign policy. I think the events in Egypt are going to play a very critical role in the future of that region. If in the future we have Egypt that is democratic, a la Turkey, I think the days of the Islamic Republic are much shorter than if we don't see that. And the regime knows this, and the regime in Iran knows this, and is trying to do everything it can to make sure the Turkish model doesn't win in Egypt.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about you truly mentioned the hostile attitude that intellects had towards Shah and thought him, perceived him as sort of a puppet regime supported by like superpower like the United States. Well, if we go back a little bit and we see that he was thrown and empowered by a coalition force that occupied the country at the end of World War II, and sort of they exiled his father, and then consequently he was to some extent was supported till we reached to the 1953, where a democratically elected government was overthrown by a coup, which was partially supported by the United States, partially by Britain, and as you said, some thugs were brought on the street to support him. It's hard to expect intellects to think something good can come out from some sort of a government, a king that is fully supported by a superpower. Even if I think myself as a sort of a intellect who is in prison, if somebody from the United States come and ask me to participate in any sort of government, first of all, as you said, it's none of their business, and it's hard to expect them to participate in this sort of, and perceive Shah as somebody who is going to do some sort of positive reform, economically or politically. So it's, I don't know how,
yes.
Doesn't it look normal for people to have such a hostile attitude towards him?
First of all, I don't think some of your axioms are accurate. The notion that the Shah was brought to the throne by the occupied forces is not true. Britain and Russia were not in favor of the Shah coming to the throne. Britain tried to bring back the Qajar dynasty. They interviewed the son of the last Qajar king. The only reason they didn't bring him back, for your information, is that he didn't speak Persian. I mean that. They interviewed him. They talked to him. We have the minutes of the discussion. Some in the foreign ministry even toyed with the idea he was an officer in the British Navy. They couldn't bring him. They tried to create a republic. They talked to Furughi about the possibility of making it a republic. To his credit, Furughi said, no, Iran needs a monarchy. So they weren't that much. The only two embassies that were not in the parliament when the Shah took the oath of office were Britain and Soviet Union, the two occupying forces that you allege brought him to power. But they wanted him to know his place. They sent a message through the Egyptian king, Farouk, who was his brother-in-law at the time. They said, if you misbehave, will do to you what we did to your father. Literally, this is the text of the message they sent through Farouk. I don't think it's abnormal for intellectuals to have defended aspects of what the Shah was doing, the aspects that were positive. Look, what about the cultural freedoms that existed in Iran? What about the religious freedoms that existed in Iran? Iran in 1975 had virtual equality for the Baha'is,
but
for
it was
the
the
Jews.
result of a coup. So a democratically elected government was overthrown, and he was in power. He became the king. So I don't know.
Well, we are all the result of the Big Bang. It depends on how far you want to go back, first of all. Second of all, the notion that it was the Americans that brought the Shah back to power, in my view, as I've tried to argue in the book, doesn't stand scrutiny. The Americans tried to bring him back to power. The British were trying to overthrow Mossadegh, certainly from 1951, but the Shah stood up to the British and would not overthrow Mossadegh illegally. It was Mossadegh who, with dubious constitutional basis, dismissed the parliament and gave the Shah the right to have a recess appointment. Sadiqi told him, point blank, that if you dismiss the parliament, the Shah has the right of appointment, Fetrat appointment. Mossadegh himself, I have found a letter, I have quoted in the book. Mossadegh himself in a letter to the Shah says, you have the right to make recess appointments. Use it, fire this damn prime minister, appoint a new prime minister. It was that decision that, first of all, prepared the ground for this, and two, it was Mossadegh's isolation from his social base that allowed whatever happened on August 19. Well, you want to call it a coup, fine. If that gives you comfort to call it a coup. No, in my mind, it is extremely simple to call it just a coup. There was a coup on August 15. They tried, and even in August 15, if you read the letter of the law, the Shah does have the power of recess appointment. It is Mossadegh who refuses to accept a fully binding order. And it is Sadiqi that tells him that. Now, you want to take comfort in calling it a coup because it satisfies everything else you want to say, that's fine. But historically, it's a little more complicated than that.
Okay. Yes.
I just want to make a couple of comments about the book itself. I think, first of all, it's beautifully written, such that when you start reading it, you just want to continue. Read as a poetic tune to it. In particular, on chapter 2, I believe it was 2 or 3, when you compared Jamshid with Shah and Zahak with the current government, and the origin of Zahak, it was a subtle reference to the ideological origin of the current government, and also another subtle reference to the fact that eventually Iran symbolized Damavand will take over, which was very impressive. The other thing, I had a question. I don't want to go further into that because you know the reason. I don't want to refer to any particular nationality. The other thing is, you translated in reference to Jamshid Farre Izadi to charisma. Is that a fair translation in your opinion?
I don't know it's fair. I think it's a common translation.
Is it a common one?
That's the common translation.
Oh,
and the Zahak reference, unfortunately, is not mine. It's Saidiyya Sirjani. Saidiyya Sirjani is the one who wrote that brilliant book,
quoted,
and I quote him in the footnote.
The comparison.
Yes.
This is the ideological origin of the current government.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Milani, for coming to MIT. What are the most striking similarities you see right now between the Green Movement and the revolution in 1979, and the movement that was involved with that? And in your opinion, what's the biggest mistake that's been made by that movement currently? Thank you.
In my sense, essentially the same coalition that came together, minus the radical clergy and their allies, is the backbone of the Green Movement. The Green Movement is nothing other than the continuation of that movement, minus this fringe. And their allies that they have now strengthened in the IRGC and the Basij. The difference between the Green Movement and 79 was in 79 you had a leader who was absolutely resolute, who was absolutely willing to send thousands to death, if need be, to achieve his end. And he showed that he's willing to do that. He was a very resolute man. He completely had strategized what he wanted to do. He out-Lenined all the Leninists. He out-democratized all the Democrats. And he was willing to send people to harm's way. Mousavi was not. The minute the going got rough, the leadership of the Green Movement said, we back down, wait for a happier day. Maybe they were right. I mean, maybe that is the way to do it. I personally think that is the way to do it, but I think that's a big difference.
Okay, thank you.
In 1979, the Shah was willing to consolidate with the opposition when the civil revolt escalated. But the opposition fiercely decided to overthrow the Shah, which led to the revolution. Today, it's a process reversed. The system is not willing to negotiate at all, but the opposition is willing to negotiate. Do you think this reversal will also lead us to kind of revolution or civil war if the way we can see the opposition is radicalizing? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question. I really think that Ayatollah Khamenei has taken the absolute wrong lesson from the fall of the Shah. Somebody should send him a copy of this book to read. Because they just told me that they're not going to allow it to be published in Iran, so somebody should translate. He has taken the exact opposite lesson. If there is a lesson in this book, is that the Shah, if he had made concessions when he was at the height of his power, he could have weathered the storm. Change in Iran was absolutely inevitable. The Islamic Revolution was not. If the Shah had made, and the Shah knew he was in crisis. I've quoted extensively from minutes of Mehdi Sami'i. The Shah calls Mehdi Sami'i one of the most respected Iranian technocrats, financiers, and says, we need a political institution to bring people into the political process. Go create a political party.
This is in 1973.
1973. And they extensively negotiate. And fortunately for us, Sami'i took notes every night he came home. He kindly gave me the notes, and I've used them in the book. You could see that they are juggling and fighting. The Shah doesn't want to give up power, and Sami'i basically says, if you don't give me some independence, this party is not going to be created. They negotiate for almost 5 months. And then the price of oil suddenly jumps again, and the Shah pulls the plug on it. Imagine a party like Sami'i with people like Professor Zarqami here, possibly as one of his founding members. It had 10 top Iranian technocrats as members, founding members. If that party was existing. Instead of that party, the Shah went and created the pseudo-fascist, absurdly incompetent Rastakhi's party. Instead of bringing people in the political process, further isolating them. If he had made concessions when he was in power, I think the regime might have been saved. Ayatollah Khamenei has decided that the reason the Shah fell is that he did make concessions. No, he fell because he made the concessions at the wrong time, when he was already on the slippery slope of weakness. And when you are on that slippery slope, every concession you make does increase the appetite of the opposition. But not when you're in a position of, imagine 75, instead of Rastakhi's, we had a bona fide, loyal social democratic party in Iran.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. How do you evaluate the role of Ayatollah Khomeini's think tank, or whatever it is believed, the people who are believed to be his think tank, in the success of Ayatollah Khomeini over other oppositions like Ibrahim Yazdi, Bani Sadr, and Qutbizadeh? They are the people who are believed, I don't know how much that's true, to be the people who helped him to go to France, give a lot of interviews, and come to the front line.
My guess is, I haven't done any serious work on Ayatollah Khomeini, but my guess is that Bani Sad and Yazdi thought they were the think tank for Ayatollah Khomeini. They were the front for Ayatollah Khomeini. They were the needed democratic apparition. Otherwise, the idea that Bani Sad would give political advice to Khomeini, who was a disciple of Kashani in 1952, is absurdly optimistic. Only Bani Sad would believe that.
Yes.
Professor Milani, happy to have you here. I have a question about the information system. I wanted to know how much Shah really knew what's going on in the country, especially in the last year, but more over time. Did he lose contact with his country? What the historian claimed? Did you find such evidence for the fact that he was losing contact? The information that he was receiving becoming more and more inaccurate over time, or we don't find? And what was the reason? What was the systematic reason for that? If that's true.
My sense is that he was losing contact. Since he was, after 65, increasingly surrounded by sycophants, people who were of the older generation, like Allah, for example, who dared challenge him, were no longer much welcome. He began to no longer travel by car.
And the death of Alam.
But the death of Alam is much later, absolutely. But if you look at Alam's memoirs, Alam isn't really that much of a, he's very much an operator. He's trying to get his own. But there are many instances where people who try to tell him the truth and he simply rejects it. I've quoted an extensive letter in 1973 from an American official to the Shah, basically telling him the country is in danger, you're isolated. Yes?
So what was the system? I mean, Savak didn't have a system of giving a daily report of the
I'll tell you in a minute. Savak did have a system, but it was not, the Shah was literally not willing to learn to get bad news. Parviz Sabiti, the head of the 3rd Division of Savak, in charge of domestic security, would occasionally write these letters, and more than once he came to the border of being put on trial. Parviz Sabiti wrote a letter on Davalou Qajar saying this guy is a crook, he is an opium addict, he is an embarrassment to the regime, he takes bribes, and they almost put him on trial for it. So even from Savak, and the head of Savak was Nasiri, a man whose only credit for the job was his fealty to the Shah. The Shah took power away from Pakravan, easily the most intelligent officer in the Iranian intelligence ministry. He was the head of Savak only for 4 years. He completely revamped Savak. He started the think tank. He started contact with the opposition. He stopped torture. Instead of him, he brought Nasiri, who literally told his underlings, don't don't tell him bad news. So he didn't want to hear bad news. And occasionally, when people would tell him that, look, you're isolated, he would boast that he gets intelligence from, I think he told Oriana Fallaci, I get from 13 different sources. But he wasn't. He really wasn't.
Yes.
Dr. Milani, thank you for visiting Boston, and I hope this is not the last one. And I had a question regarding events that led to 1979 revolution, and looking from the a little bit more distant from this event, and looking at the role of nation and how this events obviously it's very interesting, and we can learn a lot from what leaders do in such a big event, but also the nation and what they're ready for and what they're not ready for, and what they are rooting in terms of moving from, you mentioned moving from an open democratic society to a more closed and religious society. And obviously, and my conclusion from this question, I would like to have this just pay attention to the, consider this fact that if we have an open democratic
election in Middle East right now, probably Iran is one of the only country that moved toward democracy as opposed to extremism and Islamic extremism. And looking at the legacy of this 30 years and all the suffering that Iranians went through, the result is, I consider that as moving more faster than other nations toward democracy. And I wanted your comments about this. Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood your question. If the question is whether Iranians were ready for democracy in '79, if that is the question, I really, when I look at Iranian history fairly, not with grandiose extreme nationalism, it's been an incredibly heroic nation that has been fighting for democracy for over 100 years. They began the constitutional revolution, and they have been relentless since then. The constitutional revolution, and then the period between the war and the rise of Mossadegh's own period, the struggles after that period, from 55 to on. I don't believe that Iranians are not ready for democracy. I think, and I fully agree that the 30-year experience has done something to Iran that most secular intellectuals couldn't do in 70 years, which is truly secularize the core of the society.
Sure. My question about the religion.
Several other people.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes.
Early tonight and also in some other interviews, you have mentioned the contacts that Khomeini has made with the U.S. I'm just thinking that you might have expanded in the book, but I'd be appreciative if you can expand on the nature of it and the context of it a little bit more. Thank you.
The context of it is essentially from the time that he comes to Paris. He begins to look into possibilities of contacting the Americans. He clearly understands that they have a very important role to play. There are contacts in Paris, and there are extensive contacts in Tehran. And the Paris contacts are both at the official level, and then some emissaries who are sent, like Cotton, who used to be a CIA and then became a professor, and everybody understood where he came from. Cotton met with Khomeini, and he's written a very interesting report of what his meeting was. But there were also official contacts. And then there were contacts inside the country between leaders of the representatives of Ayatollah Khomeini and the military, particularly for the purpose of neutralizing the military and convincing the military to not participate and essentially side with what by then the Americans had decided was and the British had decided was a foregone conclusion. And I have not confirmed this. I have heard this secondhand, that some of his entourage in Paris recommended against the idea of contacting the Americans, saying that this is really going to come back to haunt us. And he overruled them and said, no, this is politics. They are a very important player in all of this. And he played it very openly. And as I said, we don't have they submit, the State Department submits something like a questionnaire, which they fill out in Paris. And we don't have that questionnaire, but we have the assessment of the State Department of that questionnaire. And it says, this is nothing very unusual. It's the standard third world nationalist rhetoric.
Yes.
Dr. Milani, you talked about Ayatollah Khomeini hiding his intentions at first and then getting back to the idea of Velayat Faqih. Considering the fact that his very close disciples like Ayatollah Beheshti or Hashemi Rafsanjani didn't talk about Velayat Faqih either, how do you evaluate the role of people like Ayat and Baqai in getting into that idea? And my second quick question is, you blamed Iranian intellectuals back in 1970s of not knowing Iranian society well. How do you evaluate today intellectuals' understanding of Iranian society? Thank you.
of course, it was Professor Banani who said, Banuazizi who said they didn't know, but I agree with him. I haven't studied the Constituent Assembly that passed this law carefully. But I understand from several sources that Ayat played a very key role in making the transition from that democratic early draft to this draft. He was, Ayat was close, and Ayat was close to Baghai. Ayat was a very, very interesting operative. Baghai I have studied a little bit because he's one of the eminent Persians, and he is a remarkable character. He is really one of the those characters that needs a great deal more study because he had such an influential role to play. And again, his changing of his side from the pro-Mossadegh side to the anti-Mossadegh side, I think it's one of the crucial events that helped undermine Mossadegh. Mm-hmm. Again, you could really literally see that the Americans and the British are following Mossadegh's social base almost on a weekly basis. And every time he loses one of these allies, they think he's one step closer to being vulnerable. And it is only towards 53 that they finally, the Americans at least, the British were ready to go from day one. They wanted the Shah to dissolve the parliament, declare a state of emergency, get rid of Mossadegh, nullify the Nationalization Act, and the Shah said no.
Just in one word, I think the contemporary Iranian intellectuals are far better informed, much more in touch with the social and political realities of the Iranian society than the generation of intellectuals just prior to the revolution. I imagine you would agree with that. Now, with Dr. Tierman's permission, we are going to take 2 more questions, but please make them as brief as possible because I know that you would like us to end.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Dr. Milani. Actually, that was a very interesting talk. I have just one question. I want to know, do you have any take-home message for Green Revolution? I mean, do you think they can win at the end of the day? And if they want to win, is there any, recommendation that you can give? I mean, I know it's like too much, but just I want to know, what do you think? They need
I'm hiding it.
Okay.
No, I'm joking.
But thank you.
I honestly mean that. I don't have a recommendation because I really think that the very nature of the Green Movement is that it doesn't need people who sit in MIT and describe what they should do. The fate of this movement will be determined in Iran by the Iranians inside Iran. And one of the, I think, signs of maturity of continuing what Professor Banuazizi was saying, of the Iranian intellectuals, both inside Iran and outside Iran, is that this tradition of intellectuals outside Iran thinking that they are tokhme do zarde, as we call them, that they're special things, has ended. They know their limit, they know their place, they know that Iran is, and the richness of the discourse from Iran, I think, is remarkable. I don't think there's ever been, at least in my experience, there's never been a period in Iranian history where the discourse of democracy was as rich. And look at the number of interesting books, interesting articles that are written inside Iran compared to what is written outside. In the Constitutional Revolution, almost every article of import, every writer of import was writing from outside. Where are the writers of import today who are living outside?
Including also the understanding of what democracy is.
Absolutely.
In terms of individual rights and so on. Yes, you have
Thank
the
you
last.
very much for your analysis. I just have a quick question. I want to know your expert opinion on the letter that Iranian generals signed in February 79. Was that constitutional? Could they do that? Which led to the victory of revolution. Was that letter constitutional? That's my question. Thank you.
I have to beg absolute ignorance. I really do. I don't know whether it was constitutional or not. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. But I think by then the constitutionality of it was very moot point. By then, it was a revolutionary period. And part of the reason that the military failed, again, was that even when the regime was trying to create a military government, it failed to understand the radical nature of the situation. Azhari wanted to begin his premiership with a vote of confidence from Majlis. And what the hell kind of a military government is this? It comes with a vote of confidence and has Najafi, one of the most respected Iranian jurists, as its minister of justice. Najafi calls the Shah and says, Your Majesty, you're bringing a government, you want to create fear in people. People know what I am. You don't want me as a minister of justice. And Starr said, no, we can't find anybody else. And that is the, and he begins his talk by Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He went to Majlis. The guy who was supposed to bring fear to the hearts of the opposition immediately became a laughingstock.
Dr. Chairman.